The hall gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, every corner exuding luxury and power. Guests laughed
You
loudly,
cheater!
dresses glittered like jewels, and arrogance dripped from champagne flutes. In the midst of it all, a young maid crossed the room with measured steps, holding a tray. Her downcast eyes hid the pain of being treated as invisible, but the invisibility that protected her ended when, on purpose, one of the host family's daughters pushed her. The wine spilled. The tray scattered across the floor, and collective laughter exploded like cruel thunder. The humiliation seemed complete, but then, against all expectations, the millionaire stood up and crossed the hall. Silence. Eyes followed every step, and before everyone, he did something unthinkable. He embraced the maid. The shock was immediate. The laughter ceased as if plucked from thin air. The millionaire embraced her in a firm, public, almost protective gesture, and the entire room froze. Who was this woman to deserve such a display in front of so many? Whispers began to spread like sparks. Eyes met in search of answers. But nothing was as heartbreaking as the dry click of heels echoing across the marble. The millionaire's wife, the lady of the room, slowly rose to her feet. Her eyes sparkled with contained indignation, and her every step seemed to announce a scandal about to explode. Everyone held their breath. The luxurious party was about to turn into a scene impossible to forget. If you felt the power of this story in these first moments, imagine what's yet to come. Every detail holds a twist. Every silence conceals a weight. Take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel so you can journey together to the end of this narrative, where destiny always reveals its face. The mansion's dining room looked like a scene straight out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden light that reflected off the glasses. The marble floor gleamed like a mirror, and each guest seemed to be competing to prove who wielded the most power. The conversations were sharp, laden with boasting, and the laughter of the wealthy sounded like invisible knives to those merely serving. Among them, discreetly, the young maid passed. Her steps were silent, her gaze lowered, and the tray she carried seemed heavier than it actually was, not because of the weight of the glasses, but because of the burden of humiliation that always accompanied her presence in that place. It was an evening of ostentation, and the host family seemed to delight in displaying not only their wealth, but also their ability to subjugate those they considered inferior. The guests regarded the maid with contempt, disguised as curiosity, as if observing an uncomfortable detail in the landscape. Some men whispered among themselves, laughing at the short uniform that revealed more than it should, while wealthy women turned up their noses as if the young woman's mere existence were an offense to their sophistication. With each step, the feeling of not belonging grew within her, and yet her eyes discreetly roamed the room, capturing every gesture, every face, every whispered word. There was no submission within her, only a silent pain and a hidden strength that seemed to be waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The fuse didn't take long. One of the billionaire family's daughters, known for cruelty disguised as charm, strode into the room. Her heels echoed like hammer blows, and a mocking smile formed on her lips. Without warning, she deliberately bumped into the maid. The tray slipped, the wine spilled across the floor with a loud crack, and the guests burst into laughter. It was a spectacle of humiliation, the perfect distraction for an audience that thrived on the suffering of others. The young woman took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. Her face burned with shame, but her eyes didn't fill with tears. There would be no crying, only silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to scream against the collective laughter. And it was at that moment that something happened. The millionaire, until then seated in his leather chair, observing the spectacle of arrogance, stood up. His footsteps echoed firmly in the room, and every eye turned in his direction. Time seemed to have stopped. No one knew what to expect. Some imagined he would reinforce the humiliation, others that he would simply order the mess to be cleaned up quickly. But nothing could prepare the room for the gesture he would make. Next, calmly the millionaire approached the young woman, completely ignoring the stares that followed him. And then, in a deliberate movement, he wrapped his arms around her. A firm, unexpected, almost protective embrace. The entire hall held its breath. The embrace wasn't just unexpected, it was forbidden. The entire room seemed to gasp in unison, unable to believe what they were seeing. The millionaire, known for his cold, distant and calculating demeanor, now stood before everyone, exposing himself to ridicule in the eyes of the elite, as he held in his arms the maid who minutes before had been the butt of ridicule. It wasn't a quick gesture, it wasn't an impulse. It was deliberate. His arms wrapped tightly around her, as if to protect her from the cruelty of the piercing gazes. The young woman, still trembling, didn't know how to react. Her face burned, not from embarrassment, but from the intensity of the scene. She felt exposed, judged, yet at the same time safe in a space where before there had been only hostility. The laughter that had echoed seconds before evaporated. All that remained now was the hushed murmur of the guests, unable to decide whether this was outrageous, humiliating, or simply fascinating. Some wealthy women covered their mouths with fans, shocked, as if they had witnessed an unforgivable social sin. Businessmen glanced at each other uncomfortably, trying to interpret what this gesture meant for their host's image. Was it simply pity? Could it possibly be something more? And if so, what would the consequences be? The daughter of the billionaire family who had initiated the cruelty paled. She expected nothing more than reinforcement for her cruelty. She expected to see the maid crushed once more, perhaps even fired in front of everyone as a reward for her arrogance. But instead, her friend's father, the most respected man in the room, had stood against the crowd, embracing the very person who should have been despised, her victorious smile faded in an instant. The hug didn't just say, "Don't touch her." It said something much bigger. She matters. And that was unbearable for everyone who believed the world revolved around surnames and numbers. Some curious guests approached discreetly, trying to decipher what couldn't be said. Was it simply kindness? Or was there a hidden secret? The millionaire's gaze left no doubt. It wasn't coincidence. There was intensity. There was determination. With each second, the embrace lasted. The feeling grew clearer that this young woman was hiding something no one knew, and it was precisely this sensation that plunged the room into tension. The air seemed heavier, the whispers sharper, the looks more inquisitive. The gesture that should have been simple now became a symbol of rupture, of impending scandal, of secrets about to emerge. The millionaire finally raised his head and gave his guests a firm look. He didn't need to say anything. His posture was enough. He had chosen a side, and it wasn't the arrogant ones who laughed. The maid remained against his chest, her body still wet from the incident, and for the first time that night, she didn't look fragile. She looked untouchable. But the silence that followed was broken by an unmistakable sound. The echo of high heels against marble. Each tap sounded like a premonition. The millionaire's wife advanced, her eyes fixed on the scene. There was no more room for pretense. There was no longer any way to disguise her. Indignation. The echo of heels against the marble was like a war drum, announcing the arrival of the true lady of the house. Each beat made the guests grow even more silent, as if they were facing a judgment about to take place. The millionaire's wife advanced with slow but authoritative steps, her eyes fixed on the unlikely scene. Her husband, the most respected and feared man in that room, embracing a maid in front of everyone. The room, already tense, fell into an almost suffocating silence. No one dared move. Some women hid their discomfort behind fans, fanning themselves nervously. Businessmen exchanged bewildered glances, unable to understand whether they were witnessing a gesture of compassion, scandal, or betrayal. The hostess's daughter, who had caused the fall, widened her eyes in shock. She had never imagined that her cruel game would end with her friend's own father challenging the entire room. The wife approached. Her face didn't display uncontrolled fury, but something even more dangerous, contained indignation. Her eyes sparkled like controlled fire, and every line of her expression suggested that her mask of perfection was about to crumble. Her long dress dragged imposingly along the floor, reinforcing her position as queen of the space. And yet, before her husband and the maid, her sovereignty seemed threatened. The millionaire, for his part, didn't back down. He didn't lower his head. He didn't let go of the young woman. On the contrary, he kept his arm firmly around her, as if the decision were final. His eyes met hers, and in that silent gaze was a challenge. Not an aggressive challenge, but the affirmation of someone who had already chosen a side. The guests were mesmerized. Some expected the wife to burst into screams, accusing the maid of insolence, accusing her husband of betrayal. Others expected a theatrical gesture, perhaps a slap, perhaps the girl's immediate expulsion. But none of that happened. She stood before them, motionless, as if studying every detail of the scene before acting. The young maid, huddled against the millionaire's chest, kept her eyes lowered. Her body trembled, but not from fear. It was a strange mixture of shame and dignity, like someone who, even humiliated, refused to give in completely. Her silence spoke louder than any words, and the guests felt the weight of it. Then, amid the suffocating silence, the wife stepped forward. The proximity made the room hold its breath. And when she reached out to touch her husband's shoulder, the gesture was so slow it seemed choreographed. There were no screams, no hysteria, only the imminence of something greater, something no one dared anticipate. The touch was firm. The entire room leaned forward, waiting for the outcome. And in that instant, the world seemed to stop. The wife's touch on her husband's shoulder was like the sound of silent thunder. No one dared breathe. The entire room leaned in, hungry for an outcome, torn between the expectation of a scandal or a revelation. Her hand was firm, almost icy, as if in that gesture she wanted not just to touch, but to claim territory, the territory of prestige, respect, and authority she had always believed she possessed. She took a deep breath. Her long, jewel-adorned dress reflected the light from the chandeliers, and her eyes roamed over each guest like sharp blades. There was no rush in her actions. Her wife knew everyone was awaiting her reaction, and, like a good strategist, she wanted to prolong the suspense so that every heart would twist in anticipation. The millionaire remained motionless. He did not flinch in his wife's presence. His arm remained firmly around the young maid, as if nothing could change his decision. The look he gave her was neither one of supplication nor justification, but of silent challenge. An invisible duel raged between them, without words, without sudden gestures, only through the strength of who would dare to yield first. The maid, still wet and with her uniform clinging to her body, didn't dare look up, but her posture said something few could perceive. It wasn't just fragility. It was silent resistance. The entire room had already witnessed her downfall and humiliation, but now it witnessed the improbable, someone who didn't need to open their mouth to expose their collective arrogance. The room, once a stage of ostentation, had become a courtroom. Each guest felt they were facing a trial that wasn't just the maid's, but all of them. It was as if in that embrace and that touch, the roles of victim and executioner were being reversed before their eyes. And then the wife spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it echoed like a contained thunder. Now everyone has seen. Now everyone knows. The sentence fell upon the room like an unbearable weight. What did she mean? Was it jealousy? Was it confirmation of a long-kept secret? Or was it simply an acknowledgement of something everyone suspected, but no one dared say aloud? Whispers exploded, from one corner to the other. Everyone interpreted it differently, but they all felt the same. Their world had just changed. Some guests widened their eyes, others hid their faces, embarrassed after laughing just minutes before. The hostess's daughter, pale, wanted to disappear, for now everyone knew her cruelty had unleashed something much greater. The millionaire, impassive, stood firm. There were no explanations, no justifications. Just that embrace, which now no longer felt like compassion, but rather revelation. The wife didn't scream, didn't attack, didn't lose control. Her strength lay in her words, in the silence that left others free to imagine what was happening behind the scenes. And that was precisely what hurt the most. No one knew the full truth, but everyone understood they were facing something unbreakable. The once noisy hall was now a prison of silence, where each guest carried the weight of having witnessed a night that would never be forgotten. The room remained suspended in the air after those words from the wife. Now everyone has seen it. Now everyone knows. None of the guests dared break the silence, knowing that any comment could be used as ammunition against them. The sentence was unclear, but it carried a crushing weight laden with hidden meaning. Whispers began to slither across the tables like venomous snakes. What did she mean? Is he involved with the maid? Or is there something even bigger behind this? The maid remained in the center, embraced by the millionaire. But now she no longer seemed merely a victim of humiliation or an object of pity. Her silence was disturbing, and the simple fact that she didn't react as expected, not crying, not pleading, not defending herself, transformed her image. It was as if her stillness carried a truth that no one there was ready to hear. The wife, erect as a queen before her court, looked at everyone with contempt. There was no need to shout. Her icy calm was even more menacing than her fury. She seemed to say with her eyes, "You judged, you laughed, but now you will have to deal with the consequences of having witnessed the truth." Some older guests, attentive to details, began to notice something that had escaped them before. The maid's posture was no ordinary servant. Her discreet chin lift, the way she kept her shoulders firm even in the face of embarrassment, reminded her more of someone accustomed to being watched than someone trained to be invisible. It was as if the uniform were merely a cheap disguise, incapable of hiding the essence of someone older. The hostess's daughter, the author of the cruel shove, now seemed to shrink at the sight. The laughter that had flowed from her lips minutes before had disappeared. In its place, a silent fear began to take shape. She understood, even if she didn't want to admit it. She had poked something beyond her reach. What had once been merely cruel amusement had now become an irreversible mistake, witnessed by all. The millionaire remained motionless, firm in his gesture. He said nothing, he didn't explain, but the firmness of his arms and the serenity in his gaze confirmed that he knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't impulse, it was choice. Suddenly one of the older guests blurted out in a trembling voice, loud enough to be heard, "That look. I've seen it before." The sentence spread through the room like a spark. Eyes turned to the woman, eager for explanations, but she immediately fell silent, as if she'd said too much. The tension mounted. No one knew what was happening, but everyone sensed that this night would leave an indelible mark. And as the whispers grew louder, the wife smiled bitterly, almost cruelly. It was the smile of someone who didn't need to say anything else, because the entire room was already doomed to seek the answer she had hinted at. The ballroom, which earlier in the evening had celebrated the wealth and power of a family, now transformed into a stage of mystery, fear and unease, and everyone understood that the next gesture, the next word, could forever change the fate not only of the maid, but of everyone who witnessed the scene. His wife's words still echoed off the golden walls of the hall like an invisible curse. Now everyone has seen it. Now everyone knows. But what exactly did they know? That was what no one could answer, and the mystery only fueled the whispers. The hall, once vibrant with music and laughter, was now a whirlwind of nervous murmurs. Some guests approached discreetly, their looks ranging from curiosity to reverence. Others kept their distance, as if afraid to get involved in something that could cost their reputations. There was a tension there that wasn't just social, it was almost political, as if an invisible power line had been crossed. The maid, still firmly in the millionaire's embrace, suddenly seemed much larger than the short, wet uniform she wore. The fabric clinging to her skin was merely a detail compared to the aura of mystery growing around her. It was as if she carried within her a story none of the guests dared to confront. Her silence was her weapon, and every second she didn't speak made the imaginations of those present race faster. Some began to whisper the names of ancient families, of missing heiresses, of scandals hushed up over the years. Others murmured that perhaps it was a lover in disguise, someone who shouldn't be there, but who carried evidence of a deep secret. Nothing was said aloud, but fear was etched on their faces. Each hypothesis seemed more frightening than the last. The millionaire remained motionless, his face set like stone. He didn't look at the guests, nor at his wife. His gaze was fixed solely on keeping the young woman safe, as if the simple act of releasing her were a social death sentence for everyone there. He didn't need to speak. His gesture was confirmation that there was more to it than met the eye. His wife, with a bitter smile, watched the room react. She knew she didn't need to say anything else. The poison had been unleashed, and now it was the group of guests themselves who were responsible for spreading it. Her silence, combined with that enigmatic phrase, was more devastating than any direct attack. And then suddenly someone discreetly pointed out, "Look at her neck." The focus returned to the maid. A previously unnoticed detail now shone under the light of the chandeliers. A gold pendant, partially hidden by the fabric of her uniform, gleamed discreetly. It was no ordinary piece of jewelry. Those with trained eyes could recognize it. There was a coat of arms there, a symbol that could never be used by chance. The murmur exploded like wildfire. Some recoiled in shock, others stared, trying to confirm. The symbol seemed to confirm that the woman wasn't there by accident, and suddenly, all the humiliation they had witnessed minutes before transformed into something much bigger, a trap to expose their true selves. The tension reached a breaking point. No one knew if they were facing a victim or a dangerous revelation, but everyone was certain of one thing: the night wouldn't end without the mystery coming to light. The entire hall held its breath. The pendant's glow still seemed to illuminate the atmosphere like a forbidden flame, but what made the tension multiply wasn't the gold or the crest. It was the moment the maid looked up. For the first time that night, she wasn't hiding, wasn't looking at the floor, wasn't avoiding the gazes that pierced her like blades. Her expression changed the course of the party. There was no fear on her face. There was no submission. There was firmness, a dignity so silent it seemed deafening. The guests, accustomed to seeing servants bow their heads, were stunned by that simple gesture. It was as if the young woman, with just a glance, had stripped them of the power they so proudly displayed. The millionaire, still firmly at her side, didn't need to move a muscle. Her gesture was enough. The wife then lifted her chin. Her eyes met the maid's in a clash of invisible forces. The entire room felt the weight of that silent duel. It was as if two women faced each other in an arena that needed no words, only the intensity of their gazes. One represented the pride sustained by titles, fortune, and tradition. The other, the hidden truth, the resistance born of silent pain that now stood before everyone. No one dared intervene. Even the musicians who kept their hands on their instruments stopped. The silence was so thick that hearts could be heard pounding. The guests were divided between those who averted their eyes, unable to bear the scene, and those who couldn't stop staring, mesmerized by the invisible force confronting them. The maid didn't need words, but she still let out a sentence in a low tone, almost a whisper, but which everyone could hear. Silence says more than any lie. It was like a blow. The wife blinked slowly, absorbing those words, and for a moment lost control of her expression. It was as if the young woman had torn, with a simple sentence, the veil of pride she wore like armor. The guests shuddered. This wasn't just a personal confrontation, it was symbolic. The humiliation of minutes before, once served as a spectacle, now returned against each and every one who had laughed. The entire room was reflected in that clash. Arrogance versus dignity. The hostess's daughter, pale, slowly receded into the background, trying to disappear. She knew she had become a key player in a story that was now slipping out of her control. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't laughter. They were murmurs of fear, of recognition. The maid wasn't invisible. She never had been. The wife, feeling the weight of the collective gaze upon her, found strength in her pride. She straightened her posture, squared her shoulders, and let out a cold, almost artificial smile. But the entire room knew that smile didn't hide defeat. It was a mask. It was despair. The maid stood still, firm, as if she knew she had already won. Her gaze, full of silent truth, was more devastating than any scream or attack. The battle had been fought without a drop of blood, but everyone knew who had been wounded. The millionaire finally let out a deep sigh, as if confirming the inevitable. The truth was unfolding, and no one there had the power to stop it. The entire room was plunged into a stifling silence, but everyone's eyes remained fixed on the detail that had escaped them until then. The golden pendant. The chain had slipped from the maid's uniform, and the small medallion reflected the light from the crystal chandeliers like a forbidden flame. It was no ordinary piece of jewelry. It was a coat of arms, a symbol carrying history, blood, and power. The murmurs erupted in waves, growing louder and louder, until some guests could no longer contain their trembling voices. "It's impossible," said a grey-haired woman. "I know that coat of arms. It belongs to a family that doesn't mix with anyone." Others nodded nervously, looking away as if fearing the weight of what they were witnessing. The wife, motionless before the scene, slowly closed her eyes. There was no shock on her face, but rather the bitter expression of someone who already knew the truth and was just waiting for everyone else to discover it. When she opened her eyes again, the room realized this wasn't just marital jealousy. It was something much deeper. The waitress, feeling the eyes burn her skin, didn't move. She simply raised her head with a serenity that completely contrasted with the image of someone humiliated just minutes before. The pendant on her chest seemed to transform her before everyone's eyes. She was no longer a servant. She was an unknown quantity, a dangerous unknown quantity. The millionaire then took a deep breath. His eyes swept the room, finding one by one the perplexed faces, the half-open mouths, the trembling hands holding glasses. He knew he could delay no longer. The truth no longer fit into the silence. And yet, when he spoke, his voice was low, calm, but so powerful that no one dared interrupt. She was never just a maid. The impact was devastating. The words pierced the room like a sharp blade, slicing the breath from every guest. It was the confirmation everyone had feared and, at the same time, hoped for. The embrace was no longer just a gesture of compassion. It was recognition. It was a public announcement that this woman carried something no one could ignore. The reactions were immediate. Some guests put their hands to their faces, horrified at having participated in the humiliation. Others stood up, trying to get a better look at the pendant, as if needing to confirm with their own eyes the truth that was already imposing itself. Fear ran like an invisible electric current, feeding on the silence of the young woman, who remained motionless, but now lifted by the dignity the world had tried to steal. The wife finally took a step back. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but enough for everyone to understand. She had lost her center of power. The queen of the ballroom was no longer hers. The guests' gazes no longer followed her. Now all attention was focused on the woman whom, minutes before, everyone had thought invisible. And deep in each heart, a painful certainty took hold. That night would never be forgotten. The entire room seemed petrified. The millionaire's words still echoed like suppressed thunder. She was never just a maid. Every guest, every glance, every breath was glued to that scene that was no longer just a scandal. It was a revelation that would demolish masks and ruin vanities. The wife, until then sovereign of the space, took a step back, small but enough for everyone to see. Her authority, built on decades of pride and appearance, began to dissolve in the face of something more powerful than any title: the silent truth. She tried to sustain what remained of her image, lifted her chin, forced a cold smile, but everyone knew. Defeat was etched in her eyes. The maid, however, didn't need to say anything. The pendant on her chest, reflecting the golden light of the chandeliers, spoke for her. Her upright, steady eyes pierced the consciousness of each guest. There was no hatred, no revenge, but a dignity so unshakable that it became unbearable for those who had laughed at her just minutes before. And it was in this contrast that the turnaround was complete. Minutes before, she had been kneeling on the ground, drenched, the target of cruel laughter. Now she stood erect, enveloped in respect, while her wife, once the untouchable queen, was the one trembling before the collective gaze. The weight of humiliation had shifted. The millionaire, still standing firmly beside her, said nothing more. He didn't need to. The simple act of standing there in front of everyone was confirmation that the young woman's position could no longer be challenged. The room was divided. Some lowered their eyes in shame, others watched in fascination, unable to believe what they were seeing. And then the maid did something no one expected. She took a step forward, gently pulling away from the millionaire's protective embrace. She stood alone, without a shield, without needing defense. The silence grew even heavier. Her hand touched the pendant, and for a moment she stared at it as if holding a secret greater than the world. Then she looked up at her wife and said in a low but firm tone, "The real humiliation wasn't mine. It was yours." The words cut through the air like razors. They weren't spoken with spite, but with the force of a definitive sentence. The entire room felt the impact. Those who had laughed found themselves stripped bare, exposed in their own cruelty. What had seemed like just a night of fun and ostentation now became a shameful memory that would haunt them forever. The wife didn't answer. There was no way to respond. Her tense body betrayed defeat, and her lost gaze revealed that, for the first time in years, she didn't know how to maintain her mask of power. The music began again, slow, almost funereal, filling the void left by the silence. It wasn't party music. It was mourning music. The symbolic mourning of crushed arrogance, of exposed pride, of false superiority buried in plain sight. And so, the young maid left the hall. There was no smile on her face, no need for triumph. Her greatest victory lay in the way she left, erect, dignified, carrying within her a power none of them could steal. Behind her remained a collapsed hall, forever marked by the night when a silent truth destroyed an entire empire of appearances. If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe for more stories like this.